Hey everybody, it's Ross Walters from chromaticlessons.com, and I have, I don't want to call this a music theory lesson. This is a very practical way that musicians communicate with each other, and that's with numbers, and it needs to be addressed, and the potentially confusing thing about this, so by the way, here's my hand, I'm right here, even though you can't see my face, and I could do the talking with hands thing, but I don't think I'll be playing any harmonica on this video. So just a heads up, this is a comprehensive musicianship lesson, and a very practical one, though, I think. We're going to talk about how musicians communicate with numbers, and you can see that I have the majors. This is the C major scale from C to shining C, and I've assigned numbers to these, and this is what we do. This is what musicians do. If you go to a blues jam, you will hear musicians talk about, hey, this is just a regular 12-bar blues, 1-4-5. And that means that here's a very basic blues that only has 3 chords in it. So, in C, that would be 1, and then 4 is F, and 5 is G. So this is this is one way that musicians use numbers to communicate with each other, and that's talking about chord progressions. This is not the only way, as we're going to see, that musicians use chord progressions or numbers to communicate with each other. Let me just demonstrate this. There is a piano under here, a Casio keyboard. So I'm playing a C triad, and if I just keep the, that's my hand position, it's probably not correct. I am a self-taught piano player. C, and then I just move up the major scales, and I keep that distance, and I just keep playing white notes, spaced a third apart. Those are triads. Now, it's generally understood when musicians are communicating with each other and talking about numbers that these chords have certain qualities. It's generally understood that 1, 4, and 5 are going to be major triads. It's also generally understood that 2, 3, and 6 are going to be minor triads. So if you do this exercise where you're going up the piano, your ear might not hear, it might not sound like a minor chord because it's in this context of this major scale thing. But if you look at it, there's a minor third in it. So there's a D minor chord, there's an E minor chord, F major, G major. It's generally understood when someone says, hey, we go to the 6. A lot of musicians will say, hey, we go to the minor 6. Which is kind of like an extra bit of information that you don't need. Because the 6th chord in this diatonic scale context is always going to be minor. Now the 7th chord, usually you don't hear musicians describe a chord progression where they say that it goes to the 7. But this brings up something important because we can modify these, and we could talk about, musicians will talk about, hey, so this goes flat 7, 4, 1, and all of a sudden this B is a B flat. And I don't know why, but it's generally understood when you have these altered scale degree things in chord progressions, it's generally assumed that they are major triad kind of quality. So that's my take on it. So anyway, let's talk about the flat 7, 4, 1. You've heard that before. I like to compose and arrange with that so much, and I felt like it was so cliche that it was illegal for me to use it, but I figured out that there's no such thing as a patented chord progression. flat 7, 4, 1. You'll also hear musicians say, hey, this climbs up. It goes 1 flat 3 to 4. So, flat 3. So we're talking about an E flat chord. And again, it's a major triad, but theoretically, there's no theory to back that up, but there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's just, if musicians are on the bandstand, they say, hey, this goes flat 3 to 4, like everybody just seems to automatically know. There's a rather dramatic chord progression that is the flat 6, flat 7, 1. It's kind of a climb up. Here's the value of using numbers in this context, is that it doesn't matter what key the song is in, and it is a kind of a musical verbal shorthand. Instead of, like, if you're in A and you're doing a 1 flat 3 4, instead of saying, hey, we're going to go A, C to D, you know, I mean, it doesn't seem like that much of a shorthand, but it just translates over all of the keys. And here's the thing. So there's this deal called the Nashville number system, and this is the basis of it, is that chord progressions are represented as numbers. And I don't know all the ins and outs of it, and there's some notational things that they do, and there's also some problems I have with it if a song modulates. And there's also some confusion I have if a song is based in a minor key, and I've seen people notate that minor chord as a 6. So I'm not going to get all into the Nashville number system, but I'm letting you know this is a basis of the Nashville number system, is to use 1 through 7, and then as needed, because most popular music like this fits. There's some crazy jazz, Wayne Shorter kind of compositions where this is not going to work. Like, you're just going to have to write out the names of the chords. So I talked about flat 3. I talked about there's another thing that we can do to modify things in this chord progression to give us more options, and that is to a 2 chord is always going to be a minor quality unless otherwise specified. So here's the thing. Somebody may say, hey, so this progression goes 1, major 2, 4, 5. And because the 2 is normally minor, you have to specify a major 2. You might say, hey, this chord progression goes 1, major 3, to 6, to 5, to flat 7, to 4, 1. Anyway, so those minor chords, to make modifications to them and specify to the other musicians, hey, it goes to a major 2. By the same token, the chords that are normally major, you can make them minor, like the 4 chord, and to me it's a very beautiful cadence to go from a minor 4 to the 1. And I'm going to talk about the minor 5, which to me is my secret weapon. The minor 5 is a great substitute for the flat 7. So, like, here's 1 to flat 7. Back to 1. Now check it out. Minor 5. And we can use the same voicing, like flat 7 with a 5 in the bass. And that brings up something else. Let's talk about that. I just want to point out first, like, because this leads into this, like the 7 chord, you don't normally see that written out in a chord progression. But what you may see is this: 5/7. And that sounds like this. That's a G chord with a B in the bass. You may also see this. I'm going to move my camera here a little bit. So you may see 4/6. You may see 1/3. And I'll play those for you. Here's 4/6. I'll play the 1 chord. There's a C chord. And then here's 4/6. This is an F over an A. And we could do 4/6 to 5/7. Watch this. Up to 1. And it's just a nice bass line, but the top chords are 4 and 5 chords. The root notes are 6 and 7. Now let's talk about 1/3. That's a C chord with an E in the bass. So you may hear So anyway, that's part of the number system, is that what we got going on, we got the numbers 1 through 7 that we're using to describe chord progressions. We are making some modifications and altering some of these scale degrees in order to create interesting chord progressions, like with the flat 7, the flat 6, the flat 3. We're also changing the quality of chords so that chords that are normally major in this diatonic context, we're breaking all kinds of rules, and so we have a 4 chord that's a minor, or a 5 chord that's a minor, or we have 2 or 3 chords that are major quality. So having said all that, that is one aspect of using numbers to communicate with other musicians. I'm going to continue writing the major scale up because I need to show you this. And this ledger line above the staff is a A. So the number 8, you rarely will hear a musician use the number 8 if he's talking numbers to describe something. You will, however, hear people talk about the octave. So here's a couple questions for you. How many legs does an octopus have? And the answer is 8. How many sides does a stop sign have? It's an octagon. It has 8 sides. Which month of the year is October? And see, that doesn't work because it's the 10th month of the year. But generally, you get the idea. OCT has something to do with the number 8. So when you hear musicians talk about the octave, that's 8 diatonic tones up, right? And we are back to where we started. We started on C and we ended with C. 8 tones up the diatonic scale, the major scale. But I'm going to continue adding numbers here, and I want to show you something. Here's 9, here's 10, here's 11, here's 12, and here's 13. So when we construct chords, what we are doing is we're skipping thirds. So we have root, third, fifth is our triad. And what we're doing here is we're skipping root, third, fifth, and if we keep skipping, there's a 7th chord. Okay? Let me talk about 7th chords for a second, and let me talk about how to notate 7th chords in just standard notation. Like if I wrote this down here, C7, it's generally understood that that is a dominant quality chord. We would have to make this a B flat in order to agree with that chord symbol. So to notate what this chord actually is, I'm just going to do this. You could say C Maj 7. That's one way to do it. Or you could say C capital M 7. I prefer, and if you ever see this, this is what this is, the triangle. C, that, and that actually covers C major 7 or C major 9. It gives you a little more flexibility. I'm going to keep going up. So here we're skipping the 9th. The 11th, let's talk about the 11th. Normally in the context of a chord extension, that's what these are, chord extensions. And this is a totally different thing than a chord progression, because now we're talking about one chord, not a chord progression, and we're describing the quality of this chord and the extra notes that it has, the color tones in the note, in the chord. So, but I need to talk about the 11. Most of the time you don't hear people talk about the 11 unless it's a sharp 11. So that is, that's an F sharp in the chord. There's a C major 7 with a sharp 11. It's a intriguing, mysterious sound. And here is the 13. I'm going to go back to this idea of if you see C7, if you see C9, if you see C13, those are all dominant quality chords. It's just understood that when you have the letter with the number, that the chord is not minor, neither does it have a major 7. It's got a flat 7 to it. So anyway, if you hear about this number 13 described in a chord, it's don't be freaked out about that. It's just that it's a C dominant chord that has an A in it. C13. So, I think that's all that I need to say about chord progressions and chord extensions, numbers used as chord extensions. The other way that musicians will use mostly the numbers 1 through 7, maybe up to 9, is when they talk about melody and they're trying to describe a melody. So even if I'm teaching a simple melody like Mary Had a Little Lamb, I will say, hey, it starts on the 3rd, and it's generally understood in the key of C, that's E, right? Hey, this song, the melody jumps from the 5th to the root. So if someone's describing, no, it goes from the 6 to 7 to, then it skips up to the 9. They may use the number 9 to describe the D. So anyway, 3 ways that musicians communicate using numbers: chord progressions, chord extensions, and melodies. Hey, I thought of a couple other things that I wanted to say about musicians using numbers to communicate with each other. I did want to point out the strange mathematics of these chord extension notes here. So I just want to do some of these equations. So I'm going to flip this over. Or maybe I'll leave it here because we need to see this. Anyway, so 9 equals 2. In this whole number system, you need to know that 9 equals 2. I'm going to say something about the 10th. So therefore 10 equals 3. They're both the 3rd of the chord. I just remember, so my mother, she was a piano player, and she would talk about piano players who had such a reach that they could play a 10th. And I'm going to go down to the keyboard here. a tenth. And I know piano players that can go beyond that, but here's a tenth. Let me get a real piano sound. Check it out. That is a tenth. It's an octave plus a third. So I can kind of barely do it, right? But that's an interval of a tenth. That's the only time that I've ever heard people talk about that particular interval is a piano stretch thing. The 11th is the same as 4, and that's important to know. 11 equals 4, and most of the time people are indeed talking about the sharp 11 when they talk about the 11. Then this is important to know that 13 equals 6. Those are just some things to know. The 13th is an A. The 6th is an A. They're the same note, right? And they both have different functions. And I totally didn't mention this at all. I kept talking about 7th chords, a C major 7 or a C dominant 7, right? And I didn't mention the fact that there's what we call, this is very confusing because we call this chord a 6th chord. Instead of a 7th chord, it's a 6th chord. 6th. Does it have a th on the end? But that's this chord. It's the triad plus the 6th. Not the 7, but the 6th. So here's what's confusing about that. Hey, it's a 6th chord. And guess what? In the key of C, this is a 6th chord. An A minor. I just played a C6. And the A chord is also known as, in the number system, the 6th chord. So that is a little bit of like, okay, which one are you talking about? Maybe that's why musicians say, we're going to the minor 6. Which also could mean something different. While I'm here, let me mention that the Nashville number system, I did not mention this earlier, there's a thing with singers. This is a thing with diva vocalists coming into the studio and saying, it's too high, right? Or it's too low. I think I could resonate better if we raise the pitch a half step or a whole step. And so when you have charts written out in the number system, nobody has to rewrite any chords out. You don't have to rewrite the charts. You just need to say, hey, it's a number chart, and we're going to do it instead of A, we're going to do it in B flat. You know, they'll raise it up a half step. So there's the diva singer thing. While I'm talking about chord nomenclature, I want to use a big word. I was talking about these numbers, like if we have a C7 or a C9 or a C13, that means that they're dominant chords. Whenever you see the letter and the number, those are dominant chords. My camera, why is it like blurry? I don't like this. Okay. And then I mentioned that several ways to write C major 7. Capital M was one of them. C maj 7. There's 3 different ways to write a C major 7th chord. Let's talk about how you can write C minor. This is important. I like to do that. That means C minor. C and a minus. So I know it's like, looks like a bad grade. Hey, so that's that song that you played in C minor. That song that you played in C minor, you get a C minus on it because you sounded terrible. But C small m, maybe you'll see C mine 7. So different nomenclature.